If you aren't familiar with the story, feel free to continue chatting quietly or whatever, but I know that most of the people here have... This is the last scene. Not long, so it'll take just a minute or two to read it. And then I have a poem that Bob wrote, and I'll read that as well. Just kind of give us back into the spirit of Bob and Mike. The only thing I have to say for those of you who might forget about, Kevin has made his trip to Alameda, and this is the very last scene of the novel. Coming into the Bay Area after dark left Kevin with no sense where they were. The freeway exit signs in Oakland started at 98th Avenue and worked down until they reached the Alameda exit, and Jerry swung onto surface streets. They went through a garishly lit tunnel and then up on suburban streets lined with trees very much like where he grew up in the South, only much more closely spaced. When Jerry parked in front of a modest little bungalow, Kevin's heart thudded in his chest. The porch light was on and one window glowed from within, but Kevin could see no movement inside. I need to get my sea bag from the back seat, Jerry said, opening his door. Kevin got out and flipped the seat forward. Moira climbed out, and Andy passed the bag to Kevin. What if she doesn't come outside? I've got to at least see her. Jerry took the bag, and they stood before each other awkwardly, Jerry looking down at the sidewalk and took a deep breath. Well, he said, looking up at Kevin. After a moment, he added, I guess this is it. He held out his hand. Kevin took it reluctantly. Jerry made a tight grin. You're going to have a great time in Frisco, Kev, he said, but his voice was not convincing. Kevin couldn't think. He realized he was holding Jerry's hand rather than shaking it. Dropping his hand, he blurted out, I really have to take a leak. Can I use your bathroom? Jerry glanced at the house. Okay, let me go inside first for a minute, tell Elaine. He turned and walked to the porch, then disappeared through the door. Moira leaned against the car and asked softly, You okay? No, didn't show. You look like your dog just died, she said, reaching out to adjust his collar. Smile or she's gonna know. Jerry appeared at the door and motioned to Kevin. I'll be lucky if I don't throw up, Kevin muttered, and walked across the front yard. Inside he found Jerry standing with his arm around a small, attractive woman with dark hair and no makeup. This is Kevin, Jerry said, my camping buddy. I'm Elaine, she said, smiling and holding out her hand. Thanks for bringing my husband back, she laughed a bit nervously, Kevin thought. Yeah, Kevin started. His mouth and throat went dry. Camping, he croaked stupidly. He felt his face starting to burn with the blush he knew she could see. Use your bathroom? He almost said, ma'am, but he stopped himself in time. Jerry said, second door on the left, and Kevin fled. In the bathroom, he peed shakily, taking deep breaths. Washing his hands, he looked at himself in the mirror and tried to smile, but he looked grotesque. He turned and saw a picture of Jerry in a cup atop a small dresser. There were a dozen snapshots in the cup, and he thumbed through them quickly. One showed him in a bathing suit on a beach with palm trees in the background, standing in front of a multicolored wooden paddle boat with an outrigger pod on one side. A tiny brown man with a leathery face grinned toothlessly next to Jerry. Kevin figured it was from the Philippines that Jerry had talked about so often. He slipped it into his shirt pocket quickly and opened the door. As he stepped into the hall, another door opened, and a child about 3 feet tall darted in front of him, squealing, Daddy's home! And trotting toward Jerry. Kevin froze, his gut twisting. As he watched Jerry scoop the child into his arms for a kiss and, Hey, sugar, you're supposed to be in bed. The hall seemed to warp around him. Kevin shuffled ahead, afraid he might faint if he didn't get outside. Nice to meet you, he said to Elaine, then, see you, as he passed Jerry with his eyes down. He bolted through the door and out onto the lawn, his eyes suddenly blurry with tears. He braced against the car next to Moira. Kevin, wait, Jerry called from behind him. When he felt Jerry's hand on his shoulder, he shrugged it away and spat out, Why didn't you tell me you had a kid? Jerry moved in front of him. I couldn't, man, he pleaded. Nothing would have happened with us if you knew. Kevin looked him in the eye. Nothing should have happened with us if you've got a kid. He felt his lips tremble, but he held Jerry's gaze until Jerry finally looked down. You fucking used me, man, Kevin growled. When Jerry looked up again, his face seemed odd. "I warned you it was just for the trip," he said weakly. "Yeah, and you warned me you were an asshole, too. I should have listened." Kevin leaned against the car again. "Go on, Jerry. Go on back to your wife and your kid," he said. Jerry tightened his lips. "Sorry, man," he said quietly. "Thought we understood each other. Was just trying to be what you wanted me to be." He turned and repeated, "I'm sorry," and started to walk away. Kevin watched him go, and something snapped inside him. "Just remember, Jerry," he hissed at Jerry's back, "she can never fuck you." Jerry stopped in mid-step. Kevin could see his shoulders slump. Jerry's head bowed down for a moment, and then he slowly walked back to his front door. When the porch light went out, Kevin turned and hit the roof of the car. "Shit," he spat out. "Shit, why did I say that? Why did I have to say a shitty thing like that?" He heard Andy clear his throat in the back seat. "Sounded like a pretty accurate observation to me." Moira touched his back and asked, "Want me to drive, Kevin? I'll get us home and you can get some sleep at our place." "Can you drive a stick?" "Honey, I grew up on a farm in Iowa. I was double clutching a tractor when you still had trainer wheels on your bike. No offense." Kevin stared ahead numbly as Moira piloted the VW back through the tunnel and up onto the freeway again. There were lights everywhere and big signs of lanes and lanes of traffic, but all he could see were images of the running child in pajamas and Jerry cradling him? Her? He never decided which. They slowed to pass through a toll booth and then started a long climb up a bridge bigger than any Kevin had ever seen. As they approached the San Francisco city limit sign on the bridge, a light flickered in the back. Andy stuck his hand between the seats, holding the joint out for Kevin. "We always fire up a doobie when we cross into the city," he gasped, holding in the smoke. Moira turned her face and covered her lips without taking her eyes off the road. Kevin held her for her to toke. After a round of hits, they passed through a tunnel that loomed up suddenly in the middle of the water, then popped to the other side onto a suspension bridge with the famous hills of San Francisco below. Towers reflected the water at the edge of the bay. Beyond them, he could trace the glowing streets that seemed to go straight up. Kevin heard Andy strumming his guitar behind him as he gazed out over the glittering, magical city he had dreamed about for so long. "I left my heart," Andy crooned, "clink, clink, 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 in Alameda." Kevin wanted to say something, to explain himself, but he couldn't speak. He could only stare at the lights of San Francisco and cry.
Oh, well,